The hardest part about leading SWAT isn't the danger, it's the paperwork that follows when everything goes wrong. I'm Commander Hector Morales, McLennan County Sheriff's Office, and I've been running tactical operations for 15 years. Started as a deputy, fresh out of the academy, worked my way up through narcotics and gang enforcement before they handed me the keys to the armored vehicle. In all that time, I'd never filed a report quite like the one sitting on my desk right now, marked "Confidential Eyes Only" in red ink that still looks wet 3 weeks later. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in March of 2025. Federal tip about a weapons cache in an abandoned compound about 12 miles east of Waco, close enough to the old Branch Davidian site to make everyone nervous. The informant claimed to have seen military-grade firearms being moved in and out of a concrete block building that supposedly housed a doomsday prepper group. Nothing we hadn't handled before, but given the location's history, the brass wanted it done fast and clean. I assembled a 6-man team: Sergeant Rodriguez on point, Officers Chen and Williams for entry, Davidson and Murphy for perimeter, and myself calling plays from the command vehicle. Standard dynamic entry protocol, body cameras rolling, everything by the book. We'd done this dance 100 times in buildings just like this one, flat-roofed, narrow windows, single entry point that could be a funnel or a trap depending on who was waiting inside. The compound sat at the end of a dirt road that looked like it hadn't seen traffic in months. Tall grass had grown up through cracks in the foundation, and the whole place had that particular stillness that comes with true abandonment. No vehicles in sight, no signs of recent habitation, but our intel suggested the weapons were being stored temporarily, moved through rather than permanently housed. As we staged our approach, I remember thinking the silence felt wrong somehow, not peaceful, but expectant, like the building was holding its breath. "Command, this is Rodriguez. Ready for breach." "Copy that. Execute. Execute. Execute." The first sign something was off came 30 seconds after entry. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio with confusion rather than the usual calm professionalism. "Command, we've got a problem. This hallway doesn't match the floor plan." I checked the blueprints we'd pulled from county records. Single corridor running east to west, 3 rooms branching north. Storage area at the back. Simple layout, no surprises. "Clarify, Rodriguez." "Sir, I'm looking at a T-junction that shouldn't exist. Corridor splits north and south here, but according to this blueprint, I should be standing in the middle of the main room." Body camera feeds were supposed to stream directly to my command terminal, but the signal kept cutting in and out. I caught glimpses: concrete walls, metal doors with peeling paint, fluorescent fixtures hanging at odd angles, but nothing that gave me a clear picture of what my team was seeing. "Davidson, Murphy, any visual on the interior from your positions?" "Negative, sir. Windows are painted over from the inside." That's when Chen's voice came through, tight with something I'd never heard from him before. Real fear. "Command, you need to see this. There's evidence of a previous raid in here." I felt ice settle in my stomach. "Explain." "Zip ties on the floor, still tight around nothing. Like someone cut them off suspects who were already gone. And sir, there's a tactical vest here with Morales on the name tape." The radio went quiet, except for static. I looked down at my own vest, my own name tape, then keyed the mic. "Chen, that's impossible. We manufacture these vests specifically for our department. Serial numbers, everything." "Sir, the serial number matches yours. I'm reading it off my own vest right now. Same number." Williams chimed in from somewhere deeper in the building. "Got the same thing here, Command. Spent shell casings, .40 caliber, same as our service weapons. But they're cold. Been here a while. And there's body cam footage." "What do you mean, body cam footage?" "Someone left a camera here, sir, still recording. I can see. Jesus Christ." Williams, report. "Sir, it's us. On the footage, it's our raid. But we're arresting people who aren't here. 3 suspects in custody. All of them. All of them look like they died years ago. Starved, sir. But in the footage, we're reading them their rights like they're alive. I was already moving toward the building, sidearm drawn, when Rodriguez's voice stopped me cold. Command. The layout's changed again. I'm in a room that's got to be twice as big as this building is from the outside. And sir, there are files here. Case files. All of them have our names on them. The body cam feed suddenly cleared. All 6 streams coming through in perfect high definition. What I saw made me reach for the radio to call for backup, then stop with my finger hovering over the button. My team was moving through rooms that couldn't exist, rooms that branched off from other rooms in impossible configurations. And in every room, evidence of our raid, our exact raid played out with suspects who cast no shadows and left no footprints. Chen was examining what looked like an evidence bag with his own signature on the chain of custody. Davidson, who was supposed to be on perimeter, appeared in the footage walking through an interior room he couldn't have accessed. And in one terrible moment, I watched Murphy handcuff a figure that looked familiar, too familiar. It was Gary Nosner, one of the FBI negotiators from the 1993 siege. But Nosner looked exactly as he had then, 32 years ago, and his eyes held the hollow stare of someone who'd been dead for decades. All units, fall back now. My voice came out as a whisper, but they heard it. Sir, we found the weapons, crates of them, but they're evidence from the original Davidian compound, tagged and dated April 21st, 1993. Get out of there. Now. The body cam feeds went dark one by one as my team emerged from the building, each man looking like he'd seen something that had aged him years in the span of 20 minutes. We regrouped at the vehicles and drove back to headquarters in complete silence. The official report states that we found the building empty. No evidence of weapons storage. Recommend no further action. 6 signatures at the bottom, including mine. But late at night, when I can't sleep, I pull out the unofficial report, the one that will never see daylight. The one that describes rooms that rearrange themselves, evidence of raids that never happened, and security footage of dead men being arrested by officers who are still very much alive. Last week, Rodriguez put in for a transfer to traffic division, said he didn't want to carry a gun anymore. Chen started seeing the department psychologist, telling her about dreams where he's always walking through the same concrete hallway but can never find the way out. And sometimes, when the radio is quiet and I'm alone in my office, I swear I can hear my own voice echoing from somewhere far away, reading rights to suspects who don't cast shadows, in a building that remembers everything and forgets nothing at all. The compound is still there, 12 miles east of Waco. The county condemned it a week after our raid, but the paperwork got lost somewhere in the system. Officially, it doesn't exist anymore. Unofficially, I drive out there sometimes, just to make sure the doors are still closed and the windows are still painted over. They are. But sometimes I think I can see shadows moving behind the paint, and I know that somewhere inside, 6 officers are still conducting their raid, arresting ghosts, following procedures that will never end. Some places never stop being prisons, even after the last inmate walks free. I'm Tactical Officer Zara Okafor, San Francisco Police Department, and I've been running point on high-risk entries for 8 years. Started in patrol, worked gang enforcement in the Tenderloin, then moved to SWAT when they needed someone who could think fast and shoot straight. Cut my teeth on drug raids and housing projects where every door might hide an ambush, worked my way up through domestic terrorism cases and organized crime interdiction. In all that time, through all the abandoned warehouses and fortified crack houses, I'd never encountered a crime scene that felt like it was investigating me back until we got the call about Alcatraz. The tip came through federal channels on a fog-heavy morning in April of 2025. Coast Guard had spotted unusual boat traffic around the island during the night hours. Always the same pattern: quick approach from the Richmond district, 30-minute window on the island, then departure toward Sausalito. Homeland Security suspected arms trafficking, using the old prison as a temporary staging area between overseas shipments and mainland distribution. Made sense from a tactical standpoint. Isolated location, multiple escape routes by water, and enough abandoned infrastructure to hide substantial cargo. The kind of operation that required federal coordination and local expertise. Captain Hernandez assigned me a 4-man team for the interdiction. Officers Kovac and Barnes for rear security, Thompson for communications and technical support, and myself on point. Standard contraband operation, but the location made everyone edgy. Alcatraz had been closed as a federal prison since 1963, then housed various protests and occupations before becoming a tourist attraction. Now it sat empty after hours. Nothing but Park Service security and automated systems keeping watch over the crumbling cell blocks. The island had always carried weight in department folklore stories about guards who reported for duty years after retirement, tourists who heard voices from empty cells, maintenance workers who refused to work alone in certain blocks. We approached by patrol boat just after sunset, fog rolling in from the Pacific thick enough to cut with a knife. The island emerged from the gray like something from an old photograph, all harsh angles and weathered concrete that seemed to absorb what little light remained in the sky. Our boat captain, Martinez from Harbor Patrol, dropped us at the civilian dock and promised to maintain position for extraction. His nervousness was obvious, kept checking his radio, scanning the water like he expected something to surface from the depths. The silence that greeted us felt wrong. Somehow, not the peaceful quiet of an empty building, but the held-breath silence of something waiting. Even the usual sounds of the bay seemed muffled, as if the island itself was dampening noise. "Comms check," I whispered into my radio as we moved up the hill toward the main cell house, our footsteps echoing off the concrete pathway. "Copy, Okafor," came Thompson's voice, clear and professional. "Barnes here. Signal strong. Kovac, good signal." Standard responses, but as we approached the entrance to D Block, I noticed something odd about the radio chatter. The voices sounded right, but there was an echo underneath them, like we were hearing our own transmissions bounced back from somewhere deep inside the building. Thompson caught it too, frowning at his equipment as we stacked up outside the main door. He was running frequency scans, checking for interference, but the readings showed clean channels across the spectrum. "Thompson, you getting some kind of feedback?" "Negative. Signal's clean on my end." But his expression said otherwise, and I noticed his hand trembling slightly as he adjusted the radio settings. The first cell block we entered felt larger than it should have, our flashlight beams swallowed by darkness that seemed to press back against the light. The air tasted of rust and decades-old despair, but underneath that was something fresher, recent human presence, the lingering scent of cigarettes and gun oil. We moved in standard formation, clearing each cell methodically, but every room we entered showed signs of a previous search, recent signs. Bootprints in the dust that matched our own tread patterns, fingerprint powder on surfaces we hadn't yet examined, evidence markers placed in locations where we would have put them. Not just any search, our search. "Okafor, you need to see this," Barnes called from cell 14, his voice tight with confusion. "Evidence markers, recent ones?" I moved to his position and felt something cold settle in my chest. Yellow numbered placards marked locations where contraband had been recovered, but the numbers were in my handwriting. The evidence tags bore my signature, dated 3 days in the future, with case numbers that followed our department's sequential system but corresponded to operations we'd never conducted. "Thompson, radio check. Did we run an operation here earlier this week?" "Negative. This is our first time on the island." But his voice came through the radio with that strange echo again, and underneath it, I could swear I heard something else, another voice, older, with a different accent, saying the same words a fraction of a second later. The echo sounded like it was coming from deeper in the building, from cells we hadn't yet reached. The second cell block showed evidence of an even more recent raid. Zip ties cut and discarded, still warm to the touch. Tactical tape marking cleared areas in patterns that matched our own protocols, but also equipment I didn't recognize. Body armor with department markings from units that didn't exist anymore. Communications gear that looked decades out of date, but showed signs of recent use. The equipment was arranged as if a team had just finished using it. Radios still warm, batteries showing full charges in technology that should have been obsolete before I was born. And in Cell 27 we found the first real impossibility. Command, this is Officer Jenkins. D-block secure, no contraband located. The voice came through our radio frequency, clear as day, but none of us had spoken. Thompson was checking his equipment frantically, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold air rolling off the bay. The transmission showed on his display as originating from inside the building, but the signal strength indicated it was coming from our exact location. Thompson, who was that? I don't know. Signal originated from inside the building, but it's not any of our call signs. Not any call signs in the current system. That's when Kovac's voice crackled through, tight with fear. Okafor, I found personnel files from the old prison. Guard named Jenkins worked D-block from 1958 to 1962. Says here he died in a car accident in 1964. The radio hissed with static. Then another voice broke through. Command, this is Guard Captain Wilson. Night count complete. All inmates accounted for. I felt ice spread through my veins. Wilson had been the senior guard during the prison's final year of operation. I'd read about him in the briefing materials. Died in 1991, 28 years after Alcatraz closed. But the voice on the radio was clear, professional, alive. More disturbing was that it came through on our encrypted tactical frequency, a system that didn't exist until decades after Wilson's death. All units, maintain radio silence unless emergency, I whispered. But even as I said it, more voices began bleeding through. Cell house secure. No incidents to report. Inmate 542 requests medical attention. Officer down. Officer down. Request immediate backup to cell block C. Each transmission came through our frequency, each voice distinct and professional and impossible. The voices layered over each other, creating a cacophony of reports from different decades, different administrations, different realities. But worse than the voices themselves was what we found in the final cell block, evidence of our own operation, but run in reverse chronological order. In the third block, we found equipment from the 1990s. In the fourth, gear from the 80s. Each section showed evidence of more primitive raids, older techniques, equipment that predated modern SWAT protocols. It was as if we were moving backward through time, watching the evolution of law enforcement in reverse. In the last cells we cleared, we found equipment that belonged to SWAT units disbanded years before our department was even formed. Tactical gear from the 1970s, communication equipment from the 60s, and in the very last cell, Cell 47, according to the rusted placard, something that made my blood freeze in my veins. A duty roster, handwritten in my own writing, listing officers who had died decades before I was born. My signature at the bottom, authorizing a raid that had taken place in 1963, the same year the prison closed. The paper was yellowed with age, but the ink looked fresh, as if I'd signed it moments before. Okafor, Thompson's voice came through the radio, but now I could hear them clearly, multiple voices speaking my name, layering over each other like echoes in a canyon. Guards from different decades, all reporting the same thing. Contraband located, suspects in custody. But we hadn't found any contraband. We hadn't arrested anyone. The radio crackled one final time. "Officer Okafor, this is Guard Captain Harrison. Welcome to D Block. We've been expecting you." Harrison had been the last warden of Alcatraz. He'd locked the doors for the final time in March of 1963 and died in a car accident 2 weeks later. But his voice came through our radio as clear as if he were standing next to me, and when I turned to look at Thompson's equipment, the display showed the transmission originating from cell 47, the same cell where I'd found my own signature on a roster from 62 years ago. We ran. 4 trained tactical officers, armed and armored, running through empty hallways like scared children, our own voices echoing back at us from radios carried by men who'd been dead for 60 years. Behind us, I could hear footsteps that matched our own perfectly, the jingle of key rings that held keys to cells that no longer held prisoners, and radio chatter that grew louder as we fled reports from guards working shifts in a prison that had been closed longer than I'd been alive. The fog had thickened during our time inside, and Martinez had to use radar to locate us at the dock. We came aboard without speaking, and he didn't ask questions, just gunned the engine and headed for the mainland like something was chasing us across the dark water. It wasn't until we were halfway back to the harbor that I realized our radios were still picking up transmissions from the island, voices reporting shift changes and cell counts for inmates who had been transferred or died decades ago. The official report states that we found no evidence of smuggling operations, recommends suspension of surveillance pending review. 4 signatures at the bottom, all of us agreeing without discussion to bury what we'd experienced. But I still have the evidence tags with my signature, dated 3 days in the future, and the duty roster with my authorization for a raid that happened before I was born. Sometimes my radio picks up transmissions from guards working shifts in a prison that's been closed for over 60 years, and I know that somewhere in D Block, 4 tactical officers are still conducting their search, still clearing cells, still looking for contraband in a building where time moves in circles, and the only prisoners left are the ones who refuse to admit they're dead. Martinez tells people we came back to the boat white as sheets, refusing to talk about what we'd found inside. He's right. Some places never stop operating, never stop needing guards to walk the halls and count the inmates. And sometimes, when I'm working a night shift and the radio is quiet, I hear my own voice calling in from Alcatraz, reporting all secure, all inmates accounted for, in a building where the only crime is trying to leave. Some buildings refuse to die, even after the wrecking ball has done its work. I'm Team Leader Nash Sullivan, Street Louis Metropolitan Police Department, and I've been running tactical operations for 11 years. Started as a patrol officer in the 3rd District, worked my way through gang enforcement and narcotics before taking over a specialized response team. Cut my teeth in the neighborhoods around downtown, where urban decay meets urban renewal, where abandoned buildings hide everything from meth labs to human trafficking operations. In all that time, through all the condemned structures and forgotten warehouses, I'd never encountered a building that argued with the city records about whether it existed until we got the call about Pruitt-Igoe. The tip came through a confidential informant on a cold February morning in 2025. Word was that a major drug manufacturing operation had set up shop in one of the old housing project buildings, cooking synthetic opioids for distribution across the Midwest. The informant provided specific details: Building 14, 8th floor, heavily armed security, enough product to supply half the city. Standard intelligence for that kind of operation, except for one problem. Building 14 of the Pruitt-Igoe complex had been demolished in 1976, along with the rest of the notorious housing project. Lieutenant Foster pulled the city records, architectural plans, demolition permits, even aerial photographs from the 80s and 90s. Everything confirmed what we already knew. Pruitt-Igoe was gone, had been gone for nearly 50 years. But then Foster pulled up the current satellite imagery, and we all stared at the screen in silence. There it was, clear as day, A concrete high-rise, standing exactly where Building 14 should have been, shadows falling correctly for the time of day, windows reflecting sunlight like any other occupied structure. Could be an error in the mapping system, Foster said, but his voice carried doubt. GPS coordinates get mixed up sometimes. I assigned a 5-man team for reconnaissance. Officers Patel and Johnson for entry, Detective Martinez for tactical support, Officer Walsh for communications, and myself coordinating the operation. Standard drug raid protocol, but we approached with extra caution. Something about the intelligence felt off, not just the location discrepancy, but the timing. Major operations didn't usually set up in areas with that much historical attention, too much risk of urban explorers or historical societies stumbling across them. The drive to the site took us through neighborhoods that looked like they were slowly being erased. Empty lots where houses once stood, overgrown foundations marking the outlines of vanished communities, street signs pointing to addresses that no longer existed. The Pruitt-Igoe site sat in the middle of this urban prairie, acres of empty land that the city had never quite figured out how to redevelop. Local residents avoided the area, claiming they heard voices from empty air and saw lights where no buildings stood. Urban explorers posted videos online showing nothing but grass and weeds, but sometimes their cameras caught shadows moving across empty space, shadows that fell from structures that weren't there. And there, rising from the center of the empty space, like a concrete gravestone, stood Building 14. 12 stories of institutional brutalism, windows glowing with warm light, laundry hanging from balconies that should have been demolished 50 years ago. Sullivan, you seeing this? Patel's voice came through the radio as we staged our approach. Copy that. Building appears to be occupied. But occupied wasn't quite the right word. Lights showed in various windows, and I could see movement behind the glass, but the patterns were wrong. Lights flickered on and off in sequences that didn't match human behavior, and the figures in the windows moved with a strange, repetitive quality, like they were following predetermined paths. Walsh, run the address through dispatch. See if we have any recent calls from this location. Walsh's voice came back tight with confusion. Sir, dispatch shows no record of this address existing. System won't even accept the input. But I'm looking right at the building. The first sign something was deeply wrong came when we entered the lobby. The interior matched the architectural plans we'd studied: 1960s, institutional design, concrete block walls, fluorescent lighting, metal mailboxes with apartment numbers that corresponded to historical records. But the building smelled wrong. Not the usual odors of abandonment or drug manufacturing, but something else: cleaning chemicals, fresh paint, the lingering scent of people who'd been living normal lives. The elevator buttons were worn smooth from decades of use, but the wear patterns showed usage that should have ended in '76. A bulletin board displayed community notices dated from different decades, some announcing events that had already happened, others scheduled for dates 30 years in the future. Martinez, you getting readings on any chemical processes? Negative. Air quality shows normal. No sign of drug manufacturing. We took the elevator to the 8th floor, and that's when the real impossibilities began. The elevator worked perfectly, humming quietly as it carried us up through floors that shouldn't exist. But when the doors opened on 8, we found ourselves in a corridor that didn't match the floor plan. The layout was reversed, as if we were looking at a mirror image of what should have been there. Patel, Johnson, start your sweep. Walsh, maintain position at the elevator. Copy that, Patel responded, moving to apartment 801. But apartment 801 was where apartment 820 should have been, and when Patel kicked in the door, we found something that made my blood run cold. A family was inside. Mother, father, 2 young children sitting around a dining table as if they'd been expecting us. They didn't run, didn't resist, just looked up with expressions of weary recognition. You're early this time, the father said, his voice carrying no surprise, no fear. Usually you don't get here until after dinner. Patel keyed his radio, voice tight with confusion. Sullivan, they're saying we've been here before. Negative, first time at this location. Sir, the woman is asking if we're going to arrest them again. I moved to Patel's position and found myself looking at a scene that belonged in a 1970s photograph. The apartment was furnished with period-appropriate furniture. The television showed programs that had been off the air for decades. And the family looked exactly like residents from the original Pruitt-Igoe complex. But they were talking about previous raids, describing our tactics with perfect accuracy, mentioning officers by name, including names of team members who'd transferred out years ago. Ma'am, we've never been to this building before, I said. The woman smiled sadly. Officer Sullivan, you said the same thing last time, and the time before that. Don't you remember arresting my husband for the drugs you planted in the bedroom closet? I felt ice settle in my stomach. We hadn't searched the bedroom yet. We hadn't planted anything anywhere. But when Johnson checked the closet, he found a bag of synthetic opioids with evidence tags that bore my signature, dated from operations we'd never conducted. All units, regroup at the elevator. Now. But when we reached the elevator, Walsh was gone. The radio crackled with his voice. Sullivan, I'm on the 10th floor. You need to see this. Walsh, there is no 10th floor. Building only goes to 9. Sir, I'm looking at the floor indicator. Shows floors 1 through 12. The elevator carried us to 10 without hesitation. Doors opening onto a corridor identical to the 8th floor, but reversed again, as if each floor was a mirror image of the one below. Walsh stood at the far end, pale and shaking, pointing at an apartment door marked 1012. Sir, they're in there. The same family. But they're older now, and they're talking about raids that happened last week, next month, raids that haven't happened yet. I approached the door and heard voices from inside my own voice, Patel's voice, Martinez's voice conducting an arrest that we hadn't made yet. The conversation was precise, word for word identical to procedures we'd follow, but discussing evidence we hadn't found and charges we hadn't filed. This is impossible, Martinez whispered. Sir, Johnson's voice came through the radio from somewhere else in the building. I'm on the 7th floor, and they're here too. Same family, but they're younger. Kids are toddlers, and they're talking about raids from the 1980s. That's when I understood what was happening, though understanding didn't make it any less impossible. Each floor contained the same family at different points in time, and on each floor, our team had conducted the same raid at different moments in history. But the history was wrong. Raids conducted by officers who hadn't been born yet, using techniques that hadn't been developed, finding evidence that followed contemporary procedures in investigations that predated those procedures by decades. The radio crackled with voices from different floors. Sullivan, they remember you from 1995. Sir, they're asking about Detective Harris. He's been dead for 10 years. They have paperwork showing arrests from 2030. I tried to call for backup, but dispatch couldn't locate our position. GPS showed us standing in an empty field. The building's address didn't exist in any system, but we were undeniably inside it, moving through floors that contained decades of identical raids conducted by the same team across impossible stretches of time. Each floor we visited had booking photos of our arrests, but the dates spanned from 1954 to 2055, showing the same suspects aging and dying and being born again in an endless cycle of identical crimes. Sir, Walsh's voice crackled through from the stairwell. I found the building directory. Shows residents from 1954 to present day, but they're all the same families, same names, different birth dates, spanning a century. The climax came when we reached the 12th floor and found ourselves in an exact replica of our current situation, our team conducting the same raid, wearing the same equipment, following the same procedures. But this other team was older, more experienced, and when the other Nash Sullivan turned to look at me, his eyes held the hollow stare of someone who'd been conducting the same operation for years without ever completing it. "You'll understand eventually," he said. "The building needs to be cleared, but it can never be cleared. Every floor, every apartment, every family. They're all part of the same case that started in 1954 and will end sometime after you're dead." We ran, 5 trained tactical officers armed and equipped, running down stairwells that seemed to stretch infinitely downward, past floors we'd already cleared and floors we hadn't reached yet. Behind us, I could hear our own voices echoing from different decades, conducting the same raid over and over again, arresting the same family for crimes that existed in a temporal loop spanning 70 years. The official report lists the operation as a failed raid on a non-existent location, recommends better intelligence verification procedures. 5 signatures at the bottom, all of us agreeing without discussion that some things are better left unexplained. But sometimes, when I'm reviewing old case files, I find arrest records bearing my signature for operations I've never conducted, and I know that somewhere in a building that was demolished 50 years ago, a team identical to mine is still clearing apartments, still arresting families, still trying to complete a raid that can never end because the building refuses to admit it's gone. The Pruitt-Igoe site is empty now. Just acres of grass and weeds where a notorious housing project once stood. But the satellite images still show Building 14, and sometimes patrol units report seeing lights in windows that illuminate nothing, families moving through rooms that were demolished before they were born, conducting lives in a building that exists only in the space between what was and what should have been. Through a rifle scope, you see everything twice. Once with your eyes, and once with the understanding that what you're seeing might be the last thing someone ever experiences. I'm Sniper Divided by Observer Talia Kim, Philadelphia Police Department SWAT, and I've been providing overwatch for tactical operations for 9 years. Started as a patrol officer in North Philly, worked my way through the detective bureau before specialized training put a rifle in my hands and responsibility on my shoulders. Spent 3 years in the military before joining the force. Learned precision shooting in Afghanistan where every shot counted and hesitation meant casualties. In all that time, through all the rooftop positions and long-distance observations, through urban combat zones and domestic operations, I'd never seen the same operation happen 3 times simultaneously until we got the call about Eastern State Penitentiary. The hostage situation developed on a gray March afternoon in 2025. 3 armed suspects had taken 4 tourists captive during a historical tour of the abandoned prison, demanding safe passage and transportation that wouldn't come. Initial reports came through dispatch. At 14:30 hours, tour guide called in shots fired, tourists trapped in cell block 7. The old penitentiary made for a nightmare scenario. Narrow corridors, thick stone walls that blocked radio signals, and a layout so complex that even the tour guide sometimes got lost. But the elevated guard tower on the north wall gave me perfect sight lines into the central courtyard and most of the cell blocks. I'd studied the architectural plans during our briefing, memorized the cell numbering system, identified potential escape routes and fatal funnels. Commander Brooks positioned me in the tower with instructions to maintain visual contact with both the hostages and our entry team. Standard hostage rescue protocol, but everything about the situation felt wrong from the beginning. The suspects had chosen the worst possible location for an escape, no vehicle access, limited exit routes, and surrounded by a 20-foot wall that would trap them as effectively as it had trapped prisoners for over a century. Either they were desperate beyond reason, or they knew something about the prison that we didn't. The timing bothered me too. Why take hostages during a public tour when the building would be crawling with security and guides who knew every inch of the layout? My scope was a military-grade variable power optic, capable of reading license plates at 800 yards, equipped with range-finding capabilities and low-light enhancement. From my position in the tower, I could see into individual cells with perfect clarity, watch facial expressions, even read documents if the lighting was right. The old prison spread out below me like a stone maze, cell blocks radiating from the central hub in a wheel pattern that had been revolutionary in 1829. What I saw as I settled into position made me adjust the focus 3 times, certain my eyes were playing tricks on me, or that atmospheric conditions were creating optical illusions. In cell block 7, I could see our hostages, 2 elderly couples from the tour group, hands zip-tied behind their backs, sitting against the back wall of cell 14. Clear as day through my scope, exactly where intelligence had placed them based on the tour guide's description. The suspects weren't visible from my angle, likely positioned near the cell door where they could control access and monitor the corridor. But in the same cell, overlapping the same space like a double exposure on old film, I could see different hostages. 3 young people in 1970s, clothing bell-bottom jeans, wide collars, shoulder-length hair on the men bound with rope instead of zip ties, positioned in identical positions against the same wall. Command, this is Observer Kim. I have eyes on the hostages in cell 14, but I'm getting some kind of visual interference, multiple images in the same location. Kim, clarify. Are you seeing additional suspects or civilians? I adjusted my scope again, checked the parallax settings, even cleaned the lenses with a microfiber cloth. The images remained consistent, clear, impossible, negative on additional suspects. I'm seeing what appears to be different hostages, different time periods, same location, current subjects plus historical figures in period clothing. Commander Brooks's voice crackled through with concern and barely concealed irritation. Kim, are you experiencing equipment malfunction? We need reliable intelligence. Equipment checks out, sir. Scope is functioning normally. But I'm observing what appears to be multiple hostage situations occurring simultaneously in cell 14. Different victims, different binding methods, same physical location. That's when I noticed the entry teams, and the impossible became undeniable. Through my scope, I could see Lieutenant Zhao's team stacking outside cell block 7 exactly as planned. 5 officers in modern tactical gear, Kevlar helmets with mounted cameras, carrying contemporary weapons and breaching equipment. But I could also see 2 other teams in the same location, one wearing tactical gear from the 1980s, bulkier armor and older radio equipment, another in uniforms that looked decades older still. All 3 teams were moving in perfect synchronization, but they were preparing to rescue different sets of hostages. Command, I have visual on our entry team, but I'm also seeing what appears to be historical SWAT operations, teams from different decades conducting identical raids in the same space. The radio went quiet, except for static. I kept my scope trained on cell 14 and watched something that defied every rational explanation I'd learned in 9 years of police work and 3 years of military service. The current hostages, the elderly couples, were being rescued by Lieutenant Zhao's team, their zip ties cut, hands freed, guided toward the exit with professional efficiency. But in the same space, at the same time, the 70s-era hostages were being rescued by officers in period-appropriate gear, their ropes untied, wounds treated with medical supplies from that era, and a third set of hostages from an even earlier time period were being freed by what looked like police officers from the 1950s, wearing uniforms I'd only seen in historical photographs, carrying service revolvers instead of modern firearms. Kim, can you confirm current hostage status? Team is requesting Overwatch confirmation. Sir, they're being rescued, all of them, from all 3 time periods simultaneously. But Command, the rescued hostages aren't leaving the building. They're returning to the same cell. Through my scope, I watched the impossible play out in perfect detail. Each team successfully extracted their respective hostages, led them through the corridors toward the designated exit points, following protocols that spanned decades of tactical evolution. But somehow, Despite successful extraction procedures, the hostages ended up back in cell 14, sitting in the same positions, bound again with the same methods, waiting for the next rescue operation that would fail in exactly the same way. Lieutenant Zhao, report status. Commander Brooks called over the radio. Command, hostages are secure. All 4 subjects extracted successfully. Moving to designated safe zone. But through my scope, I could see Zhao's team leading empty air, their hands positioned as if guiding people who weren't there. The hostages they believed they were rescuing were still in the cell, had never left the cell, were simultaneously being rescued again by the same team that had just completed their extraction. The scope's recording function captured everything in high-definition digital format, and later technical review would show equipment malfunction, static interference, visual distortions, impossible images that the review board would attribute to atmospheric conditions and electromagnetic interference from the old prison's metal infrastructure. But I know what I saw through that lens, recorded in my memory with the same precision that scope recorded impossible images. I watched the same rescue operation repeat across 3 different decades, each team believing they were conducting a unique emergency response. Each group of hostages trapped in a temporal loop that had been running since the prison's first recorded hostage situation in 1952. The radio chatter became increasingly chaotic as multiple operations reported successful completion simultaneously. Command, all hostages secure and accounted for. Suspects neutralized. No casualties. Extraction complete, returning to staging area. But the voices overlapped, layered across each other like recordings played simultaneously. Reports from operations conducted by officers who'd been dead for decades, using equipment that had been obsolete before I was born, following protocols that wouldn't be developed for years after their deaths. Kim, what's your current visual on the target location? Sir, all 3 operations have concluded successfully. Hostages have been extracted by their respective teams, but the hostages remain in cell 14. Teams are returning to starting positions for what appears to be another iteration of the same operation. That's when I realized the truth that made my blood freeze. Despite the warm spring afternoon, the missions weren't repeating in sequence. They had never ended. Every hostage situation at Eastern State Penitentiary was the same situation, stretched across 70 years of law enforcement history, with different teams responding to the same crisis over and over again. The suspects weren't escaping because they couldn't escape. The hostages weren't being saved because they had never actually been taken. They were all part of something larger, some kind of perpetual emergency that the prison itself seemed to generate and sustain. Through my scope, I watched Lieutenant Zhao's team prepare for another breach, having apparently forgotten they'd already completed the rescue 5 minutes earlier. Their body language showed the same pre-operation tension, the same careful positioning, the same hand signals they'd used in the previous iteration. In the same moment, I watched the 70s team stack up for their approach and the 50s team checking their service revolvers before entry. All of them believing they were responding to a fresh crisis, none of them remembering they'd done this before. Command, request permission to abort mission. Something is fundamentally wrong with this operation. Negative, Kim. Operation is proceeding according to plan. All teams report successful completion. But it wasn't proceeding, it was cycling endlessly. I watched 3 generations of law enforcement officers conduct the same perfect rescue operation, extracting hostages who returned to their cells like actors resetting for another performance, pursuing suspects who vanished the moment they were apprehended, completing missions that immediately became incomplete again. I tried to warn them, keyed my radio to break the cycle, to tell them what I was seeing through the scope, but my transmissions came through as static. Through my scope, I could see myself in the guard tower, providing overwatch for operations that had already concluded and were about to begin again, watching events that were simultaneously past, present, and future. trapped in my own observation post while my teams remain trapped in their rescue operations. The after-action report shows a textbook hostage rescue. Minimal casualties, all hostages recovered safely. Suspects in custody. 3 signatures at the bottom from team leaders spanning 70 years, all dated the same day, all claiming credit for the same successful operation. But I still have the scope recordings, stored on digital media, that shows impossible images. And sometimes, when I'm providing overwatch for other operations, I catch glimpses through the lens of teams I don't recognize, conducting rescues that happened before I was born, saving hostages who were freed decades ago but never truly left their cells. Eastern State Penitentiary is a tourist attraction now, offering guided tours of America's first true penitentiary. But they don't mention Cell 14 in the official tour, or the guard tower that still provides overwatch for operations that never end. Sometimes visitors report hearing tactical radio chatter echoing through the empty corridors, and security cameras occasionally pick up figures moving through cells that should be empty. The tour guides explain it as atmospheric effects, echoes from the building's long and violent history. They're not wrong. Some echoes just refuse to fade, and some rescues can never truly succeed because the prison itself won't release its hostages. And sometimes, when I'm alone on overwatch duty, I look through my scope and see myself in that tower, watching the same impossible operation, providing security for rescues that will never end. The worst part about breaching a door isn't the explosive charge or the violence that follows. It's the moment of silence right before, when you wonder if the people on the other side know you're coming. I'm breacher specialist Diego Ramirez, West Virginia State Police Special Response Team, and I've been kicking down doors for 12 years. Started as a patrol trooper in Charleston, worked my way through narcotics and gang enforcement before they handed me the explosive certification and told me to make holes where there weren't any before. Spent time with EOD in the Army. Learned to read buildings like blueprints, to understand how walls want to fall and where structures hide their weaknesses. In all that time, through all the meth labs and fortified compounds, I'd never encountered suspects who knew our tactical plan better than we did until we got the call about Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. The human trafficking operation had been under federal surveillance for 6 months. Intelligence indicated that the abandoned asylum was being used as a way station for victims being moved through the Appalachian corridor, with suspects utilizing the massive building's isolation and complex layout to avoid detection. The old hospital had been closed since 1994, leaving behind 462,000 square feet of empty corridors, treatment rooms, and patient quarters. Perfect for criminal operations that required privacy and multiple escape routes, terrible for law enforcement operations that depended on controlling space and limiting suspect movement. Captain Fletcher assigned me a 6-man entry team. Officers Brennan and Vasquez for rear security, Detective Lowry for tactical coordination, Sergeant Park for communications, Officer Hayes for crowd control, and myself handling breaching operations. Standard high-risk warrant service, but the intelligence briefing included details that made everyone nervous. The suspects had apparently been living in the asylum for months, knew the building better than the original architectural plans suggested, and had been observed using the old institutional PA system to communicate across the facility. Most disturbing was the report that they seemed to know when surveillance teams were positioned outside, often appearing at windows to wave at observation posts that were supposed to be invisible. The approach to the asylum took us through rural Lewis County, past abandoned coal towns and forests that had reclaimed strip-mined hills. The building rose from the landscape like a Gothic nightmare, red brick and limestone, clock towers and arched windows, designed to house over 2,000 patients in an era when mental illness was treated with isolation and restraint. Even in daylight, the structure carried an oppressive weight, as if decades of human suffering had soaked into the stones and refused to let go. Our intelligence suggested 12 to 15 suspects inside, but thermal imaging had been inconclusive due to the building's thick masonry walls and complex heating systems that still functioned despite the facility's closure. "Ramirez, you ready for primary breach?" Captain Fletcher's voice crackled through our radio system as we staged at the main entrance. "Affirmative. Charges set for door frame. Building construction is solid masonry, so we're looking at controlled demolition rather than simple door removal." But as I positioned the shaped charges against the heavy wooden doors, I noticed something that made my hands pause over the detonator. Scratched into the paint beside the entrance, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were numbers that matched our tactical frequencies. Not just any numbers, the specific encrypted channels we'd be using for this operation. Frequencies that had been assigned only 2 hours earlier and known only to our team. "Captain, we may have a security breach. Someone's marked our comm frequencies on the building." "Ramirez, clarify. How would suspects have access to that information?" "Unknown, sir. But they're here, clear as day." The first breach went exactly as planned. The doors exploded inward, filling the entrance hall with smoke and debris, creating the shock and confusion that gives tactical teams their critical advantage. But as we moved through the smoke, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Voices from deeper in the building, speaking in perfect unison. "Breacher Specialist Diego Ramirez, badge number 7439, 12 years law enforcement experience, Army EOD background. Entry team consists of 6 officers, primary breach at main entrance, secondary teams positioned at north and south emergency exits." Every detail was correct. Information that should have been impossible for the suspects to know. "All units, suspects have detailed intelligence on our operation. Proceed with extreme caution." We moved deeper into the asylum, following the floor plan we'd memorized during briefing. But the suspects stayed ahead of us, their voices echoing through the corridors, reciting information that grew increasingly specific and disturbing. "Officer Brennan, badge number 8152. Divorced last year, 2 children in custody dispute. Detective Lowry, 17 years service, cousin died in mining accident 2018. Sergeant Park, military background, Purple Heart recipient, suffers from PTSD related to IED explosion in Afghanistan. Personal information that wasn't in any case file, private details that these suspects couldn't possibly know." "Park, how are they getting this information?" "Unknown, sir. But they're not just guessing. They know things about us that aren't in official records." As we cleared the second floor, the voices began reciting our tactical procedures in real time. "Team will advance to second floor patient wing. Ramirez will breach rooms 14 through 18. Vasquez will provide rear security. Hayes will control suspect movement toward east stairwell." They were describing our movements before we made them, predicting our decisions with perfect accuracy. The security monitors throughout the building were still functional, showing feeds from cameras that had been installed during the facility's conversion to a tourist attraction. But what I saw on those screens defied explanation. The monitors showed our raid in progress, but the officers conducting the operation looked wrong. They wore our equipment, followed our procedures, moved with our precision, but their faces were slightly different versions of our own, older, younger, scarred, unmarked, as if we were watching ourselves from alternate timelines. "Captain, are you seeing the security monitors?" "Affirmative. That's not us on those screens." "Sir, it looks like us. Same gear, same tactics, but different faces." The breakthrough came when we reached the central treatment wing and found the suspects, 15 individuals sitting in a perfect circle in what had once been the asylum's main therapy room, hands folded, eyes closed, speaking in absolute unison. But they weren't speaking words anymore. They were reciting our classified mission briefing word for word, including operational details that had been classified above our clearance level. This is a joint federal and state operation targeting human trafficking networks, operating through abandoned institutional facilities in the Appalachian region. Primary suspects are believed to be utilizing Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum as a temporary holding facility for victims being transported between major metropolitan areas. Information we'd never heard before, briefing details that apparently existed at levels above our operational knowledge. All units, suspects are reciting classified information beyond our clearance. This is not normal criminal behavior. That's when the suspects open their eyes simultaneously and looked directly at me. They spoke in unison, but now their voices carried the exact cadence and tone of my own voice. Breacher Specialist Diego Ramirez, you will complete this operation successfully. You will arrest all suspects without incident. You will file a report stating that the human trafficking network has been dismantled, but you will never remember what you saw in this room. The monitors around us showed dozens of identical raids, our team conducting the same operation over and over again, with slight variations in equipment, tactics, and outcomes. Different versions of ourselves, arresting different versions of these same suspects, all of them speaking in unison, all of them knowing information they shouldn't possess. Ramirez, we need to abort this operation. But even as I reached for my radio, I could hear my own voice coming from the suspects. Negative, Park. Operation will proceed as planned. All suspects will be taken into custody. Mission will be logged as successful. I tried to speak, but the words coming from my mouth weren't my own. My team moved to arrest the suspects, but we were following procedures we hadn't planned, using techniques we hadn't trained for, completing an operation that felt like it had been rehearsed 1,000 times before. The after-action report shows a textbook human trafficking bust. 15 suspects in custody, victims successfully rescued and provided with appropriate services, network disrupted. 6 signatures at the bottom from team members who all remember the operation slightly differently, all agreeing that something felt wrong, but none able to articulate exactly what. But I still have fragments of memory that don't fit the official narrative. Suspects who knew everything about us, monitors showing impossible images, voices that spoke our words before we thought them. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum is a tourist attraction now, offering ghost tours and paranormal investigations. But they don't mention the therapy room, where 15 suspects sat in a circle, speaking in unison, knowing information that existed beyond the boundaries of normal human knowledge. Sometimes I drive past the old asylum and see figures in the windows, conducting operations that look familiar, arresting suspects who look like the ones we captured but somehow different. The trafficking network was dismantled, according to official records. But sometimes I wonder if we arrested the real criminals, or if we just became part of something larger, a system that uses law enforcement officers as actors in operations that repeat endlessly, with suspects who know our every move because they've seen us make those moves before, in different times, with different faces, in a building that collects law enforcement memories and replays them like old security footage. The most disturbing evidence isn't what you find in a raid, it's what finds you looking back from inside the files. I'm Entry Team Leader Cora Blackwood, Pennsylvania State Police Criminal Investigation Unit, and I've been running operations against child exploitation networks for 7 years. Started as a patrol trooper in Montgomery County, worked my way through vice and cybercrime before taking over specialized investigations that required both technical expertise and tactical coordination. Spent countless hours in digital forensics training, learned to navigate the dark corners of the internet where predators hide their crimes, developed the stomach for evidence that would break most people. In all that time, through all the seized computers and encrypted files, I'd never encountered evidence that seemed to be documenting its own collection until we got the warrant for Pennhurst State School. The investigation began with a tip from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Digital forensics had traced a series of image uploads to servers hosted in an abandoned institutional building in Spring City, Pennsylvania. Technical analysis indicated sophisticated operation, encrypted communications, layered anonymization, and production-quality content that suggested organized criminal enterprise rather than individual predators. The location made tactical sense from a criminal perspective. Isolated, structurally sound, and carrying enough historical baggage that locals avoided the area. Pennhurst had been closed as a state school for the intellectually disabled since 1987, leaving behind buildings that had housed thousands of vulnerable individuals under conditions that scandalized the nation when they were finally exposed. Lieutenant Santos assigned me a 5-person team for the operation. Detective Yang for digital evidence collection, Officers Miller and Reeves for tactical support, Sergeant Foster for coordination and prisoner transport, and myself handling entry and scene management. Standard cybercrime raid protocol, but the target location required additional precautions. The old state school was a sprawling complex of connected buildings, some parts structurally unsound after decades of abandonment, with a history of break-ins by urban explorers and homeless populations. Intelligence suggested the suspects had been using the former administration building, which retained electrical power and had been modified with modern computing equipment. The drive to Pennhurst took us through Chester County farmland, past developments that had grown around the abandoned campus without quite encroaching on the property itself. The state school sat on over 700 acres, red brick buildings connected by covered walkways, designed in an era when institutional architecture emphasized both permanence and isolation. Local residents had mixed feelings about the property. Some wanted it developed, others insisted it should remain a memorial to the patients who'd suffered there. What everyone agreed on was that the place felt wrong, especially after dark, as if decades of human misery had left psychic residue that couldn't be demolished along with the buildings. Blackwood, we ready for primary entry? Lieutenant Santos's voice came through our encrypted radio as we staged outside the administration building. Affirmative. Building appears to have been modified with modern security systems, multiple cameras, electronic locks, equipment that wasn't part of the original institution. But as we approached the main entrance, I noticed something that made me call for a tactical pause. Security cameras positioned around the building were tracking our movements with mechanical precision, but the footage wasn't being recorded locally. Multiple data cables ran from the cameras to equipment racks inside the building, but additional cables led to transmission equipment that appeared to be broadcasting the feeds to external locations. Santos, suspects are live streaming our approach. This operation may be compromised. Copy that. Maintain radio discipline and proceed with entry. The first breach revealed a scene that belonged in a high-tech corporate office rather than an abandoned state institution. The suspects had converted the former administrative spaces into a sophisticated computer center, with dozens of workstations, server racks, and monitoring equipment that represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in investment. But what immediately caught my attention wasn't the technical setup. It was that every computer screen was displaying footage of our current operation. All units, suspects, have live surveillance of our raid. They're watching us on multiple monitors. Yang, start documentation and evidence collection. Miller, Reeves, secure the suspects. But the suspects weren't hiding or resisting. 5 individuals sat calmly at workstations, wearing tactical gear identical to ours, complete with body armor, helmets, and equipment configurations that matched our loadout exactly. Their uniforms bore patches and insignias that looked official but represented law enforcement agencies I'd never heard of. Chester County Emergency Response Unit, Pennsylvania Digital Crimes Task Force, Regional Cybercrime Investigation Team. Ma'am, Officer Miller called from across the room, these subjects are claiming to be law enforcement. They're showing badges and credentials. I examined the identification they presented. Official-looking documentation, badge numbers that followed standard formats, photographs that matched the individuals we'd detained. But the agencies were fictional. The authorization codes didn't correspond to any real departments, and the credentials bore dates from operations that hadn't happened yet. Detective Yang, what are you finding on the computer systems? This is impossible, Blackwood. These computers contain detailed documentation of our operation, mission planning files, tactical briefings, even personal background information on our team members. I moved to Yang's position and looked at the screen. Files dated weeks before our investigation began, containing operation plans identical to our actual procedures. But more disturbing were the video files' high-definition footage of our current raid, recorded from angles that showed our team moving through the building, conducting searches, collecting evidence, footage that had been created before we entered the building. Yang, check the timestamps on these files. They show creation dates from 3 weeks ago, but the content shows our current operation. And there's more hundreds of similar files, showing what appear to be identical raids conducted by different teams. The video files were organized by date, stretching back months. Each folder contained footage of teams that looked like us, conducting the same raid in the same building, but with subtle differences. Different officers, different equipment, slight variations in tactics and timing, all of them arresting suspects who claimed to be law enforcement officers from agencies that didn't exist. Sergeant Foster, run these badge numbers through the verification system. Already did, ma'am. No matches in any law enforcement database. But the subjects insist they're conducting their own operation against a child exploitation ring. That's when I realized what we were looking at. The computers contained evidence of dozens of identical raids, all targeting the same criminal network, all conducted by teams that believed they were the only ones investigating the case. Each team found the same evidence, arrested the same suspects, and filed reports that would disappear into a system that generated new versions of the same investigation. Ma'am, one of the suspects said, his voice carrying the same professional tone I used in court testimony. We're Entry Team Leader Marcus Webb, Pennsylvania Digital Crimes Task Force. We're conducting an operation against individuals using this facility for child exploitation. You're interfering with an ongoing federal investigation. I looked at his credentials again. Perfect documentation for an agency that had never existed, authorized by supervisors whose names appeared in no personnel records, conducting operations that paralleled ours with impossible precision. Detective Yang, are you finding any actual evidence of child exploitation? That's the problem. Every computer contains evidence of crimes, but the evidence shows our operations, videos of raids, photographs of evidence collection, recordings of suspect interviews. It's all law enforcement activity, but it's documented like criminal behavior. The monitors around the room showed multiple feeds of our current operation, but from perspectives that couldn't exist. Cameras positioned inside our radio equipment, viewpoints from inside evidence bags we hadn't yet sealed, footage recorded from angles that would require cameras to be mounted inside our own gear. All units, we need to abort this operation. Something is fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. But as I reached for my radio, I saw myself on the monitors. Not just current footage, historical recordings, showing me conducting this same raid weeks, months, possibly years earlier. Different equipment, different team members, but the same procedures, the same discoveries, the same moment of realization that the evidence was watching us back. Ma'am, Sergeant Foster's voice carried confusion and fear. The suspects are showing documentation of our arrests, booking photos, case numbers, court records, all dated from operations we've never conducted. The final revelation came when Detective Yang accessed the central server. Thousands of case files, all involving identical child exploitation rings, all investigated by different versions of law enforcement teams who believed they were conducting unique operations. Each case file contained the same evidence collected by different officers, documented by different agencies, processed through different jurisdictions, that shared only the detail that none of them actually existed. Blackwood, one of the suspects said, removing his helmet to reveal a face identical to Detective Yang's. "You'll file your report, collect your evidence, and close this case." But next month, another team will receive the same tip, conduct the same investigation, make the same arrests. The evidence collects itself, and the raids never end. We completed the operation according to protocol. 5 suspects in custody, computers and digital media seized as evidence, case files submitted for prosecution. But the evidence disappeared from the system 3 days later, and the case was reassigned to a unit that didn't exist. I still have copies of files that show footage of operations I never conducted, and sometimes I check the Pennhurst property on satellite imagery, looking for signs of activity in buildings that should be empty. The suspects we arrested were processed and released when no prosecutor could be found to handle the case. Their credentials were verified by agencies that vanished from official records the moment anyone tried to contact them. And sometimes, when I'm reviewing evidence from other cases, I see brief glimpses of footage that shows teams investigating crimes that mirror my own work, conducted by officers who look familiar, but work for departments that exist only in the evidence they collect. Pennhurst State School is scheduled for demolition, but the permits keep getting delayed by bureaucratic complications that no one can explain. The administration building still shows signs of recent occupation, though security companies report that their equipment malfunctions whenever they try to monitor the property. And somewhere in the digital evidence storage of a law enforcement system that spans multiple realities, footage of our raid continues to be filed as evidence of crimes that consist entirely of investigating themselves